All right, now before we get started, I'd like to briefly introduce Opsgility. We are the global leader in the Microsoft Cloud Readiness and we offer multiple self-paced on-demand classes focused on Microsoft Azure, Office 365, Dynamics CRM, including classes for Microsoft certification, exam preparation, among many more. And we are constantly adding to our courseware. We also provide instructor-led both in-person and virtual, ranging from enabling your sales team to sell cloud-based solutions to deeply technical training for IT professionals, data specialists, DevOps, and of course, cloud developers. Our newest offering is the Opsgility Cloud Sandbox. The Cloud Sandbox gives you the ability to provide controlled access to Azure for testing, development, or training for an organization of any size. You may go to our main site to schedule a demo with our team to show you the incredible benefits this product has to offer your company. Do you need help with moving your organization to the cloud? Our readiness planning can help by identifying the skill gap within your company by utilizing our customer success team and senior cloud architects to help identify needs and create a customized strategic plan to ensure your readiness budget is invested wisely and efficiently. And, of course, we offer our online learning platform. You have access to manage all your learning. We offer full support from team-based learning management as well as customized learning paths and tracks, as well as full reporting and tracking features on your user access, progress, and more. So why Opsgility? Well, the numbers speak for themselves. We've already trained over 10,000 students with Opsgility in 2016 alone with our resources. Oops. Sorry, went a little too fast there. Lastly, here is the list of virtual open enrollments we are currently hosting in the upcoming month to meet some of your education and exam certification needs. We have a 7533 class coming up next week. The following week, developing 532 class, the week of the 24th, designing and implementing cloud data platform solutions, and also the week of the 24th, the 475 exam course. And just a heads up, we are offering you a 30-day free trial of our online service with the promo code TryOpsgility, all caps. Additionally, you can take 15% off the course price on those open enrollment courses I just mentioned with the promo code OPSWEB15, all caps, just for watching this webinar. And if you are a business and want to try our services out for your company, contact us by phone number provided or email at sales@opsgility.com to schedule a demo of the service, and we will set you up with a 30-day pilot for your team. Thank you, and Chris Peachman, it's all yours.
All right, sorry about that. I was muted to get my screen share working, so everybody should be able to see it now. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, I guess, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to the introduction to Azure for Developers webinar from Opsgility. My name is Chris Peachman. I'm a Senior Cloud Solution Architect and Trainer with Opsgility. I'm also a Microsoft MVP with Azure. I've mostly worked as a consultant over the last 15 plus years, and I've been building solutions on Azure in the cloud since the initial general availability all the way back in 2010. I'm now working at Opsgility to help enable teams and enterprises in the cloud. So getting into Azure, currently there are 34 Microsoft Azure regions globally online today, with 4 more additional regions that are coming in the near future. Azure has the largest infrastructure footprint of any public cloud provider. This gives you the ability to deploy workloads close to your customers and have the advantage of using Microsoft's backbone for connectivity. So if you're new to cloud computing, you kind of hear a lot of talk about different terms like platform as a service or infrastructure as a service, even software as a service. So I'm going to first clarify kind of what these mean in a little more detail. So infrastructure as a service, or often referred to as IaaS, is a set of infrastructure level capabilities such as providing virtual machines and low-level network capabilities that are delivered as pay-for-use services. If we were to use the on-premises data center as an example to compare this, IaaS provides an alternative to managing the physical servers, networking hardware, and all of the supporting needs of running your own physical data center and machines. In Azure, virtual machines and virtual networks are the primary features that map to the infrastructure as a service, or IaaS term. And then platform as a service, this is often referred to as PaaS, are higher level sets of functionality that are delivered as consumable services for developers who are building applications. PaaS is about abstracting developers from the underlying infrastructure to enable applications to quickly be composed. In Azure, there's several platform as a service, PaaS services, such as Azure Web Apps, Storage, Azure SQL Database, just to name a few. And then we have software as a service, or SaaS. These are applications that are delivered using a service delivery model where organizations can simply consume and use a complete application. Typically, an organization would pay for use to the application, or the application could be monetized through ad revenue even. One of the greatest examples of SaaS-based applications from Microsoft would be Office 365. And while there's many SaaS applications built on Azure, the core of the platform is really about that infrastructure, IaaS, and platform or PaaS-oriented services, which we'll talk a little bit about both of these in this webinar. So starting off, the typical Azure data center is much like an on-premises data center that you deal with today. There's racks of servers which are dependent on power, cooling, network, and so on. As we saw on the previous slide, one of the previous slides, Azure does span across the globe, is what is referred to commonly as hyperscale. That is a piece that is totally managed by Microsoft, along with all the physical hardware and everything managed by Microsoft. And then on top of that infrastructure, we have components that make up the actual infrastructure as a service features or services within Azure. This is comprised of compute, storage, networking services. The networking is actually provided as a software-defined networking stack, which is very flexible and configurable for your needs. These are the building blocks you can leverage to either build solutions from scratch or replicate, migrate, and back up existing workloads you have in your current data centers when moving them into the cloud. Built on top of that infrastructure, we have Azure's PaaS, or Platform as a Service offerings. These services provide an even further abstraction to the underlying infrastructure to allow your developers to focus solutions, building their solutions versus scaling, security, configuration, and building any infrastructure, since all the infrastructure components are managed for you with PaaS. In fact, there's several services provided by Azure that provide immediate functionality and use without having to sweat the details of deployment, maintenance, and of the underlying infrastructure. Some of these services are things like Azure Security Center, Azure Active Directory, Azure DNS, even Azure Web Apps, to kind of name a few. Now, moving into Azure and using Azure, we need to know kind of what an Azure subscription is. So I'm going to start with that before I go in and actually go through the portal and show you how things are provisioned and working with things. Some of the key things you need to know about Azure subscriptions are they're used to group resources together. All resources you provision in Azure will be contained and billed within the context of that Azure subscription. There are multiple ways of obtaining an Azure subscription. You can use a credit card and pay as you go, purchase from an Azure reseller, part of an enterprise agreement, or even set up a free trial, and you can get $200 in credits for 30 days to use as well in that case. And then lastly, another option that we're offering with Opsgility is the Opsgility Cloud Sandbox, which allows you to get access to an Azure subscription that you can use for development, testing, learning, sales demos, those types of things, which offers a more predictable cost and control over your usage in Azure. This way you can better control the spending on resources, particularly maybe resources that are no longer used or over-provisioned, so you don't overrun your costs as much as you would without using the sandbox. So now I'm going to move into the Azure Portal, and we'll kind of work through a bunch of demos with infrastructure, virtual machines, as well as some of the past service stuff like Azure Web Apps and deploying from Visual Studio or GitHub, that type of stuff. So first of all, I'm going to show you here, we have azure.com website. Before we start creating resources, we'll take a look at this site. This is the main site where you're able to navigate Azure documentation. If you click on the Azure, the documentation link at the top of the site, you can find links to all the different services within Azure, all the infrastructure, platform services, and those types of things, all documentation listed in there. If you go to pricing, there's pricing details and information in there too to be able to see how much things are going to cost before you would provision them. And then in the top header, we can see on the top right, there's a portal link. If you click on this, this is going to go and navigate us over to the Azure Portal, where we can log in with our organization account or Microsoft account to access our Azure subscription. I already have this open in a new tab. One way that you can navigate to this is you could navigate directly to portal.azure.com. And I'm already logged in here. So after you log into the portal, you'll see a dashboard that's similar to what I'm showing here on the screen. You can see recent resources, all kind of list of all resources in the subscription, some health information on Azure, and some get it started content. On the left of this is the navigation pane where I can browse through by resource type. I can see virtual machines, SQL databases, and other resource types. The list of resources in this navigator include just those that are marked as my favorites to show in this list. If I click on more services at the bottom, I can see a full list of the resource types. I can scroll through this list and mark additional resources as favorites. So if I click on the star to select this one, Azure Container Services, I can see Container Services then is now pinned to my navigation bar on the left. I can click and drag these around to reorder them as well to customize this list, and then if I uncheck the star, it'll go and then remove that from the list again. I can even type in to search and filter this list to narrow down to specific resources or resource types. And then on the top bar of the portal, there's a settings area. This little gear icon lets me pick different themes. I can pick different color themes in the portal, different contrast levels with colors and things to help with visibility. And then also there's a language drop down where I can localize and change the language of the portal as well. Then from the help button, we can submit support requests. We can click keyboard shortcuts, and we can see all the keyboard shortcuts that are supported by the Azure Portal. These can become very useful. For example, you can always type the question mark key to show and hide the shortcuts pane. I can type the slash key to get to the search bar on the top here to search for my resources right from the keyboard shortcut. I can click on this smiley face to provide feedback of my experience with the Azure Portal. The portal team is listening to the feedback here, and you're able to submit issues or things you like so they can continually improve the experience. I can click on this bell icon and notification icon, and I can see updates that are shown to me since the last time I logged in. Right now, it's actually showing me a notification of the remaining credits that I have on my Azure subscription that I have associated with my MSDN subscription. And if I want to drill deeper into billing information, I can see how I'm spending my credits. I can go in the navigation bar here and click on subscriptions. I can view the subscriptions that the account that I'm logged into the portal with has access to. I can click on a specific subscription. And then once this loads, I'm going to be able to see a burn rate of my spending throughout the month for the billing period, how much I've spent per resource as well. So we see the cost by resource at the top, kind of showing me what my top spenders are, and then the burn rate on the bottom. With a projection, if I continue on this trend, where will I end up at the end of the billing period? And then additionally, if I click on invoices here in this link list on the left of the subscription pane, I can see my most recent invoices on my subscription. So I can get good visibility on where I'm spending my money or my credits to be able to keep that spending where I need it to be. Now let's go back to the dashboard here. And if I type N on my keyboard or I click on this plus new link in the left navigation, I can start creating resources in Azure. So I can scroll through the different categories here. For example, in the compute category, it's going to give me kind of the featured apps are the more commonly provisioned resources in these different categories. So here I have Windows Server 2012 R2, Server 2016, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, Ubuntu Server, and a few others. And then under storage, I have access to Azure Storage account, Web plus mobile. We can provision a web app, a mobile app, Azure Logic app, CDN. Databases, we can provision an Azure SQL database to have a relational database in Azure PaaS service, or even on the bottom we have Document DB for a NoSQL document-based store as well. I can also open up the marketplace by clicking on See All in this new pane, and this is going to bring up the overall view of the marketplace with a more comprehensive list of thousands of items in the marketplace, not just from Microsoft but also third-party vendors as well. These items can be provisioned or purchased through here. You can search for things. So in the search box, for example, I could search for Hadoop and go and see all the images in the marketplace that would give me options around Hadoop support there as well. I'll clear that, and I want to go in and create a virtual machine. I want to provision a VM and get some infrastructure set up, infrastructure as a service set up in my Azure subscription. So I can search in here for any virtual machine image that I'm looking for, or I can go back and browse. So I'm going to close this and go, or I'll click plus new again just to restart here and show you under compute. Then we have options here, and in this case I'm going to pick the Windows Server 2016 data center. And then this pane gives me information about this image. Right, it's pretty self-explanatory for 2016 data center, but if it's another image from a third party, this is going to give me more details on licensing options and requirements and things like that. I'm going to go ahead and click Create on the bottom here, and it's going to give me kind of a wizard set of panes to be able to set up the initial configurations that need to be set in order to provision this resource in Azure. So to create this VM first, I need to give the VM a name. So type a name in here. I'm just going to copy that for future use. And then on the VM disk type, I can select SSD, which is going to give me solid state hard drive backed, higher performance storage. This is the recommended storage for production workloads. It's going to give you a lot higher I/O performance of your storage. And then HDD, which is going to be a traditional spinning hard disk. This is a little bit of a cheaper storage option. It's going to help you save a little bit of money on hosting this VM. I'm just going to pick the SSD in this case, and then I need to enter in the admin username and password for my VM. This is the admin login for this Windows VM. So I'll enter in a username, and I'll type in password here. And then what subscription am I creating this on? It has my subscription selected already here. And then for resource group, I need to pick an existing resource group or specify the name of a new one. Resource groups are containers of multiple resources used for an app. I'll show a little more of what this means in a little bit once we provision this VM. In this case, since I'm creating a single VM, I'm going to go and create a new resource group, leaving create new selected. I'll paste in, this is why I copied the VM name before, pasted that in, and I'm going to put group at the end of it, just to name my resource group in this case to that. Then we need to select the, specify the location or the Azure region we want to host our VM in. Again, to show you the regions and locations that are supported, I have a tab open here to the Azure regions page on the azure.com site. Azure has 34 commercially available regions today across the globe, with 4 additional regions coming in the next few months. They have new regions coming on every few months. They're continually expanding out their footprint of the cloud. I can visit this regions page to see a map of the regions and decide on the best location to deploy based on where my users or my customers are located. So for example, if my customers are located on the East Coast of the United States, then I'm going to probably want to deploy my VM into East US or East US 2 Azure regions. So I'll go back to the portal here, and then I'm going to select East US in the list, scroll up a little bit here, East US. Now click OK. We'll go to the next step in the wizard. Now I need to select the virtual machine size. You should choose the right VM for your workload based on the number of cores, the memory, disk drive size, as well as the price. Azure gives you recommendations based on popular sizes, but you can also click on the View All link here to view all the size options available to you. In this case, I'm going to pick the DS1 V2 standard instance size. This is going to give me 3.5 gigabytes of memory and 1 CPU core. Also, it's going to include a good number of I/O operations per second, as well as a local SSD storage. And I'll click Select to select that size. And then next, I can configure some advanced settings. So things like virtual network configurations, the storage account to use for storing the VM image disks, VHD images are stored in Azure Storage, as well as optional services like setting up network security group, firewall rules to be able to set up that software-defined firewall within my virtual network, software-defined network. So then I'll click OK here, and then I'll get a summary of my VM that I'm about to create. And then I can click, once it says validation has passed on the top, it's verified that any uniqueness for names and things are going to be okay. So I click OK, and it's going to go off and now kick off the provisioning or the creation of that virtual machine and all of the different resources that comprise that VM. Virtual machine creation can take a few minutes. You can track the success of it on this tile on the dashboard. You can see it has that spinner notification or spinner icon kind of showing you that it's still working on provisioning that VM. You will get a toast notification in the upper right when the provisioning has completed, or you can click on the notification icon, the bell icon, to bring up the notifications pane, and we can see the current status is it says deployment started. That's telling us that the deployment is still working. So to save us some time, I've already created a VM earlier. I can get to the virtual machines list or get to my virtual machines by going to virtual machines and navigation list on the left here. This is going to list out all the virtual machines that I have access to within my subscription. So I have a few in here already that I've created previously. We can see this webinar WinVM is the one that I just created. It's working on provisioning that. It actually says status is created right now, or creating, since it's working on it. So I'll click on this Windows VM one. This is an identical Windows Server 2016 data center VM that I created previously. On the overview pane of the virtual machine blade that I'm seeing here, I can monitor and manage this virtual machine. I can look at the CPU, disk, and network usage. I can go to an activity log to view any activity on this resource in Azure. I can diagnose problems. I can click on disks to add additional disks or change this for add additional data disks to this VM to be used, or I can click on size to go and change the instance size for this virtual machine at any time, even after it's been created. Changing the VM instance size will require the VM to be rebooted, just like any physical machine would be required to be rebooted if you add or remove physical memory sticks or change CPUs. But you can change that after provisioning, not that you have to start over with a new VM in order to change the size or anything like that. So then, because this is a Windows virtual machine, in this little toolbar of buttons on the top, I can click Connect, and that's going to open up or automatically download an RDP, a remote desktop protocol file that I can then open up on my machine, and then I'm going to be able to remote into this virtual machine using remote desktop. So I'll click Connect here. I'll type in, it has my username filled in since I actually connected to this one previously, otherwise I'd have to enter that in, and then I'll type in my password and enter. Yes, I want to trust this certificate, and now it's remoting me into this VM. So now I'm logged into and able to remote into using Remote Desktop this brand new Windows Server 2016 Data Center Edition virtual machine that I've provisioned in the Azure cloud. So now for Linux virtual machines, Azure fully supports Linux virtual machines. I know you saw the Red Hat Enterprise Linux and Ubuntu listed in the VM creation before. I'll just show that quick. If we click the plus new button and go to compute, let's say I'll pick an Ubuntu server VM. Gives me some information about it. I'll click create. It's going to give me similar settings to configure. Everything is almost identically the same except for the authentication type. For a Linux VM, you can pick SSH public key encryption for authenticating against the VM, or you can pick password encryption if you want to connect with just the password. So you have options there. But otherwise, all of the other configurations and settings, picking the size, are the same as with Windows VMs. I already have a Linux Ubuntu VM that I've created previously. I'm going to navigate to that. So again, I'll click on virtual machines here in the left-hand navigation. And you can see the top one here, Ubuntu VM, is the name that I gave it. And we can see similar things with CPU, network, disk usage, all the same options for adding data disks, managing disks, changing the VM size after provision and all that. Same capabilities, but this is a VM that's running Linux instead of Windows. We also have this toolbar on the button, or on the top. We can click the connect button, and this is going to bring up, instead of downloading an RDP file, since you would use SSH with Linux instead, it's going to give you the text that includes the SSH command to run at the command line that has the admin username and the IP address already entered in. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to go open up Bash shell. To open up Bash, in this case I'm using the Ubuntu Bash on Windows 10, and I'll paste that in and hit enter. Then I'm going to go and connect an SSH into this server. I used password authentication instead of public key, so it's prompting me for the password. So I'll enter that password in, hit enter, and now I'm remoted into this Linux VM, Ubuntu Linux VM running in Azure. If I type the top command, I can go and see all the processes that are running on my Linux VM in Azure. And if I exit out, I can disconnect from that as well. So switching gears a little bit more into resource groups now. We've provisioned virtual machine. I kind of showed Linux and Windows virtual machines. We need to fill in a little more detail about resource groups and kind of what the purpose is of those, as I mentioned earlier. So if I click on this hamburger menu and expand, and we go to more services in the bottom of the left-hand navigation pane, we can see the different resource types in Azure. And we can see there's actually virtual machines listed in here twice. There's a reason for this. So Azure has two deployment models. There's an older model, which is the classic deployment model. This is the original one from the first days of the IaaS features in Azure. This model is centered around individual services, and every API call was made to run a single operation for a single resource. For example, create a website, stop a website, start the server, stop the server, things like that. And the model works for management, but as cloud solutions have become more complex over time, and many services or VMs and things are composed of multiple services, it's become extremely difficult to deploy and manage a solution by configuring each service independently. So the more recent deployment model that was created instead, I should say the old model is actually denoted as classic here, the one I'm hovering over. The next one above it just says virtual machines, uses the newer, more recent deployment model, which is now the standard model in Azure going forward, and this is called ARM, which stands for Azure Resource Manager. This model looks at the world through the lens of a resource group. This lets you create multiple resources, manage them together, secure access to them within the portal together. As an example, if I look at one of my virtual machines, So I'll click on virtual machines here, and then I'll click on this webinar WinVM, the one we created just earlier. We can see in the essentials pane here for the VM, we can see under resource group, it shows the name of the resource group this VM is contained within. If I click on this resource group name, it's going to bring me over to view this resource group within the Azure portal. Drilling into this resource group shows me that it includes a bunch of different resources more than just the virtual machine. We can see we have the virtual machine, which is the CPU and memory reservation that we're running the machine, the OS and the machine on. We have the network interface, which is a software-defined configuration for a network interface card. We have two storage accounts. This bottom one here is for diagnostic logs to be saved, and this top one is actually the one where the virtual machine VHD disk images are being stored. And then we have the virtual network, public IP address, network security group, firewall rules. So each of these can be managed and configured separately, but they're contained within the same resource group so that you can manage, create, delete, secure them all together as related resources within that resource group. I can also see the cost of each resource in the group. If I click on resource costs here on the left, it's going to bring up and show me costs per resource. Right now it's going to show nothing or 0 for spend since we just created this 1 minute ago. Another nice feature with resource groups, if I go to automation script, resource groups can be represented as a template, which is a JSON file that defines all the resources and the relationships. Using this template, I can deploy this entire resource group together instead of creating each individual resource or even using the wizards in the portal. I can automate the provisioning and creation of these resources with this script. I can also get the code required to deploy this template with different programming languages. There's some examples in here for deployment using Ruby, .NET, as well as the Azure scripting tools like using the Azure PowerShell SDKs and the Azure CLI or cross-platform command line tool as well. So I hope this gives you a better idea and understanding of kind of why. One is why there are two types of virtual machines kind of shown in the portal, as well as kind of what resource groups are and what they're for, and why we're always associating resources in resource groups. So all right, we've created a virtual machine, connected to it through the portal, both a Windows and a Linux VM. Now I'd like to create and deploy a web application. So instead of doing this through the portal, I want to do this within my IDE. Azure has SDKs for many languages and extensions to popular IDEs, such as Visual Studio and Eclipse. Today I'd like to create a web application and deploy it to Azure from Visual Studio. So I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio, and actually I have a virtual machine with Visual Studio that I provisioned from the Azure Marketplace that I'm going to use. So I'm going to go navigate to my Visual Studio VM here, and I click Connect to connect to it. I'm going to download that RDP file. I'm going to remote into it, remote desktop. So with virtualization and virtualizing development environments, you can do that in Azure as well. There are virtual machine images with Windows Server, in this case Windows Server 2012 with Visual Studio 2015, but you can use 2017 as well. And then everything I'm showing you today with using Visual Studio to interact with Azure is all features included in the Azure SDK. So any Visual Studio version, even older versions that support the latest Azure SDK, support all of these features. So here I have an ASP.NET MVC app that I've already created. I'm just going to run it here locally so we can see it running. It's just a basic MVC template. We have a home page, an about page, contact page, nothing extensive in this case. But say we have an application that we've built, and now we're ready to publish this application out into Azure. To do this within Visual Studio, we can go to the Solution Explorer and right-click on the project and click Publish. And then we can select the published target. There's Microsoft Azure App Service. This is the service that hosts web applications in Azure. Web applications, mobile backends, or web APIs also. Here I can choose one of my existing apps, or I can create a new one. In this case, it's not showing me any because I don't actually have any provision in my Azure subscription. I'm going to click New to create a new one. And it gives me a default name. I can type in a different name here that I want to name it. And then pick the resource group I want to put it in. If I want to put in an existing resource group, I can click New and then go and type in a resource group name. In this case, I'll copy the web app name in similar fashion to what I did with the VM, add group at the end of it. And then I need to specify the app service plan to put this VM in, or put this web app in, excuse me. The app service plan, I'll click New, and then can specify the name of the app service plan, what I want to name this on my subscription. I'll do this again. The name of the web app was plan at the end. It's an example. And then pick the Azure region or location I want to host this app service plan in my web app in. In this case, let's pick Japan West. And then pick the size. The size is going to dedicate what CPU and memory is allocated for my app service plan and for my web app to run in or to run on. This actually defines the underlying fully managed virtual machine that Azure is going to spin up behind the scenes and manage for us. And then we can run our web app and just manage our app itself only in Azure, and then Azure manages the VM it for us automatically. I'll pick the S1 standard S1 tier here, 1 CPU core, 1.75 gig of memory. If I click OK, and then I click Create, it's going to go and use the Azure Resource Management REST APIs. It's going to go call against those and go and provision the resource group, the app service plan, and the Azure web app within my Azure subscription. Once that's finished provisioning, then we'll be able to go and publish our app into Azure and run our application in Azure. So now I'll switch back to the portal while it's provisioning it. If I click on the hamburger menu, I can select resource groups, and this is going to let me view all the resource groups that I have in my subscription. I can go down here to Webinar Web App Group, which is the group that I created for my web app, and I'll view the resources that it's provisioning. It shows the app service plan, and it shows app service, which is the Azure web app. So if I click on the web app, so the app service resource here in Azure, this is resource that will run my web app that we'll be able to deploy to once it's finished being provisioned. We can see, actually it shows status here is running, so it looks like it's done provisioning already. It will deploy there in a second or in a minute. And then we can set up different things in here, different settings and configurations. But if I go down here and scroll down to scale up, this allows us to change the pricing tier, or scale up our underlying VM that's hosting our web app on the fly. You can actually change this pricing tier at any time without any downtime. Right now I have the standard S1 tier. There's a little bit more expensive premium tiers, give access to a little bit more features. If I scroll down, there's basic tier, which is kind of meant for dev and test environment only. Production, you would use standard or premium. Then we also have a free and shared tiers, which actually, instead of using dedicated CPU and memory resources, you get shared memory and resources that are similar to a shared hosting environment that you might be familiar with. And there are also the cheaper options available. In this case, I'll leave it as the standard S1. Now I'll switch back to my Visual Studio, and we can see the publish dialog has changed now over to having the server, site name, username, credentials that are needed for Visual Studio to do a publish. I'll click Publish, and now it's going to go and actually compile and publish and deploy this application out into Azure. When it's finished deploying, it's going to open up a new browser window navigating to this web app running in Azure for me, so I can see it running. In the meantime here, we can see in the Solution Explorer under the project, we can see the publish profiles. It added a publish profile. This is saving the credentials and configurations for which web app in Azure I'm going to deploy to. So the next time I would go and say publish in Visual Studio, I don't have to pick that web app again. It'll know it, and then I can just click publish, and it'll publish it out again, making it easy to do over again from Visual Studio. Now it's opening up that web browser since it's finished deploying, and it's going to load up our application running in Azure. And we can see in the URL, we have the name of our web app, .azurewebsites.net. This is the default DNS or domain name that we're given to our web app when we provisioned it in Azure. It's taking a little bit to warm up the site since it's the first time it's firing up once it was deployed, spinning up that app pool and IIS underneath the covers. And now we have the same web app that it showed running locally, but we have it running in Azure this time. So going through some of the additional features now in the web app in app service, we can see there's app settings, we can set application settings, connection strings, things that are similar to like web config configurations or IS configuration. We can set up custom domains, SSL certificates to support SSL for our web app, and a number of other features in here as well. So we saw how to create a virtual machine through the portal and how to create and deploy a website using Visual Studio. And I'd like to show you how you can script it. So Azure has two scripting options. If you're a Windows user, you may be familiar with PowerShell. You can use the Azure PowerShell commandlets to leverage rich PowerShell capabilities. If you're more comfortable with command line, or you're using a Mac or Linux, you can use the cross-platform Azure CLI tools to do the same thing. Behind the scenes, both the Azure PowerShell and the Azure CLI interact with the same Azure REST APIs that the Visual Studio plugin accesses and utilizes as well to offer that functionality. Both PowerShell and Azure CLI offer similar capabilities, so it's kind of a matter of either which operating system you're using or a matter of choice to which one you want to use. So before I go and show the Azure CLI, if I go back to azure.com and we click on Resources in the top navigation menu, and then we click on Downloads, it's going to give me the option to download the SDKs for Visual Studio and different programming languages as well. But if I scroll down below that, we're going to see command line tools where we have the option to download the installer for the Azure PowerShell SDK or PowerShell commandlets, as well as the Windows, Mac, or Linux installers for the Azure CLI as well. So now I already have this installed. I'll switch over to command line. And the command line tool for Azure CLI, everything starts with Azure, kind of similar to how using Git, it all starts with Git. So I'll type Azure and hit enter, and it's just going to give me a summary of the different commands that I can run with the Azure CLI. So we can see it spit out all those commands. We scroll up, we can see the full list of everything, the different commands we can run. Now, first we need to log into the Azure subscription with the CLI. So I'll type Azure login, and I'll hit enter. And then this is going to give me the URL I have to go to, and then a code to enter in to be able to authenticate with my Azure subscription and authorize the Azure CLI to access things. So I'll open up the web browser here, and we'll open up a new tab, and we'll navigate to this URL. And I'll enter in the code. And since I'm already logged in, it didn't prompt me to log in, but I hit continue. Or actually now it's asking me, but I'll click which one I'm in, and I didn't have to enter the password because I'm already logged in. Now it's authenticated, and we can see the CLI just said, okay, now it added my subscription. So if I say type in Azure account list, it's going to list out the Azure subscriptions that I have access to with the account that I've authenticated the Azure CLI with. In this case, I just have one subscription, so it's just showing that one. Now to get started creating this Azure web app using the Azure CLI, first we need to provision an Azure resource group. So I'm going to use the Azure group command, or Azure group create command rather, and specify the name parameter, specify the name of the resource group that I want to create, then the location parameter. It's going to allow me to specify the Azure region that I want to host this in. Then I'll hit enter. It's going to go and call those Azure Resource Management REST APIs and behind the scenes and go provision that in my subscription. Now that that's done, I need to set up and provision an Azure App Service Plan. So I'll use the Azure App Service Plan create command, using the name parameter to specify the App Service Plan name, and then the location parameter to specify the Azure region, resource group parameter to specify the resource group we're going to host this in, and the SKU parameter is going to specify the pricing tier. S1 would actually specify the standard S1 pricing tier that we selected from the portal earlier. F1 is going to select the free pricing tier, and I'll hit enter, and it's going to go and access those ARM REST APIs and provision that app service plan and place it within that resource group. Now we can go and provision the web app. So use the Azure Web App Create command. And the name parameter is going to specify the name of our web app. And then the resource group parameter is going to specify the resource group that we want to put this web app in. And the location parameter is going to specify the Azure region to host this web app in. And and then the plan parameter is going to specify the app service plan we want to put the web app in. One thing to note is the location or Azure region for the web app does need to be the same region as the app service plan, since the app service plan is defining which physical hardware that VM is running on in the data center. And I'll hit enter, and it's going to go and create and provision that web app within our subscription, associate it with the app service plan, and place it within that resource group as well. So within a few seconds, I'm able to create a new web application in Azure that I can then go and deploy code to. I could do the same thing with the Azure PowerShell commandlets. The commands are slightly different, very similar, and offer the same functionality. So now we'll switch back to the Azure Portal. And I want to go see our web app. So I'm going to click on resource groups. I'm going to go to the resource group that we created for that first. And then we can see our different resources that we created, the app service plan and the app service web app within the resource group. And I'll click on the web app to go see that the web app within the portal here. Now I'd like to deploy an application out to this web app, not from Visual Studio, but from GitHub instead. So to do that, I'd like I need a repository in GitHub that has a web application that I can deploy. Luckily, Azure has code sample gallery that is based on GitHub. I can go to the azure.com site, click on resources, and then click on code samples to go view this sample gallery. I have a particular sample in mind that I'm going to use for this. In this case, I'm just going to type HTML in the search box and search, and it's actually this first one in the list, the HTML sample for Azure App Service. I'll click on that. It's going to give me a little more information about it. And then I can click on Browse on GitHub to go browse the code on GitHub. What I need for the deployment, though, is actually the clone URL from this. So I'm going to click on this green clone or download button on GitHub, and I'm going to copy the clone URL for this repository. Now I can go back to the Azure portal, and on my web app in the navigation list on the left, I can scroll down here and click on Deployment Options, and then I can choose to configure a source to deploy from, and in this case, I'll pick External Repository, and then I'll paste in this clone URL that I copied from GitHub and click OK. And now it's going to go and create that, set up the deployment options, and it's going to automatically kick off the first deployment of deploying that application out into this web app directly from GitHub into Azure. A few more things we can do through the Azure portal on a web app. If I scroll down here, we can click on backups to set up backups of our web app. Scaling up, we can scale up the web app like I showed before. We can even scale out to add additional instances of our web app if we need to. We can customize domain name, SSL, set up security scanning. There's a live console we can access to be able to browse through the file system of on the server of our web app that's hosted. And then also if I go up here on overview, if I'm a DevOps person and I want to keep an eye on the site metrics, I can view this graph here. I can click edit and add some additional metrics to show in this graph. And I can hover over this and click the ellipse button and say pin to dashboard. And if I go to the Azure dashboard, we can see it's pinned to my dashboard. So I can surface metrics and reports and things from my resources in Azure right on my dashboard. I can click New Dashboard to create an additional dashboard to have multiple dashboards that I can toggle through. Actually, if I go back to my web app here, I'll just click App Services and click on my web app. Now we're back at the App Service Blade. And then if I click on this URL, it's going to open up this web app in a new browser tab and then navigate to it. And we can see the application running. This is the application that was in the GitHub repository that we then deployed out into this web app in Azure, and it's now running in Azure without using Visual Studio or anything locally to deploy. So we've created a virtual machine, we've created some web apps, we've deployed from GitHub, we've deployed from Visual Studio, we've remoted into Windows and Ubuntu Linux from running in the cloud. Now there's two ways to create a SQL database in Azure. You can install SQL Server in a virtual machine and you get full control over the configuration of the database. In fact, SQL Server in a VM is one of the most popular things that's done in Azure. Another way to use SQL database is to use the Azure SQL Database Service. This lets you create a database in seconds without having to take care of infrastructure or manage software updates. I'll click on Plus New. to do this. And here I'll go to the databases option and I'll click on SQL database. And this is going to allow me to provision a PaaS or platform as a service based Azure SQL database in Azure. First, I need to specify the database name. And then I need to specify a resource group that I want to put this database in. Again, all resources need to be associated with the resource group. Then I need to select the source of my database. So I can pick from a blank database and just create a blank new database. I could pick a backup and restore a backup that I've taken of an existing database into this. Or I can pick sample. In this case, I'll pick the sample and I'll populate my database with the default AdventureWorks sample template. Then I need to click on server to configure the database server. I don't have any servers configured on this subscription yet. I'll click create a new server. Then I need to name my server and then specify an admin login and password for my server to log into it. And then the Azure region or location that I want to host this database server in, and click select to finish specifying the server details. And then click on pricing tier to specify the pricing for my database. The pricing tier is specified on the database level, not the server level. So you have dedicated resources per database instead of per server. We have standard and premium options with different DTUs that we can configure. A DTU is a database transaction unit. This is what's used for the pricing tiers and to specify the performance measurement of our SQL databases. This is kind of a blended measurement of CPU, memory, and disk I/O. As your solution grows, you can change the pricing tier at any point in time without any downtime of your database as well. I'll click on basic, and this gives us the cheapest option with 5 DTUs. It's actually $5 a month and up to 2 gig of database space. And I'll click apply. And then I'll click create, and it's going to go and provision this Azure SQL database. It's going to provision the SQL database server in my subscription. So now I want to navigate to the resource group. I'll click on resource groups and I'll pick the resource group for my database. And then we can see right now it doesn't have any resources, it's still provisioning. I'll click refresh and it should show something in a few seconds here. I'll click refresh a couple times. You can see it's not showing up. I'm going to check the notifications and see deployment started. It's still working on deploying this database. It's just taking a little bit here. Normally it takes a few seconds for the server to show up, and then the database itself can take a little bit longer. And now we can see the database server. I'll click on that to go to the server. One thing to note about the server is it is a logical container of databases. Since the pricing tier is specified on the database level, the server is really just a logical container providing the access with the login and password as well as different firewall rules. So if I click on firewall on the left here, I can specify the firewall, and it's actually an IP address whitelist that you specify. So I want to specify my IP address that I'm running locally. So I'll click on this add client IP, just fills in a rule with my local IP address, or I could type in a rule name and enter in a starting and ending IP address to specify a range that I want to whitelist. And I'll click save, and it's going to save that IP address range. And then also it says allow access to Azure services. This is turned on by default. So any service in Azure, it already has its IP address whitelisted, just to make it easier. You could always turn that off and then configure it separately. So I'm going to go back to overview here. And our database has been provisioned. So I'm going to click on the database to go view the database blade. And we can see information about our database, like the server name that we're going to connect to. We can click on connection strings, so we can go and view the ADO.NET, JDBC, ODBC, PHP connection information that we would need to use. We can go on the left here and configure things like changing the pricing tier at any time. We can set up geo-replication. We can enable transparent data encryption, many other features that are available. Now I want to connect to this database. So I'm going to actually go back into my Visual Studio that I had before, and I'm going to click on Server Explorer. I'm going to expand Azure node in here, and then expand the SQL Databases node. And this is going to go and load the SQL databases that I have access to. Here I have my database. I'll right-click on this and click on Open in SQL Server Object Explorer. So then it's going to go open up SQL Server Object Explorer, connect it to this database in Azure. First, we need to enter in connection information. It has everything filled in except for the password. So I'm going to enter in the password and hit enter, so that basically selected the connect button and now connected in with the Object Explorer. Kind of wait for this to load. It's going to load out the databases within that server. You can see my database. I can expand this. I can expand tables. It's going to load up all the database schema that's in this default AdventureWorks template that we provisioned, or it would show the information and schema within your database. And I can right-click on the database and click New Query, and then I can go and type in a query. So select star from sales lt.product. And select from the products table, click Run, and it goes and runs that query against my database in Azure using my local tools. I think I have a typo in here. But you can use familiar tools like the Visual Studio tools for working with databases, as well as SQL Server Management Studio to connect to and work with an Azure SQL database. All right, so we've created a VM, a web app, we've created a SQL database, kind of showed how to query the database. Going back to azure.com, kind of go to the home page here, we can see, it showed the links for documentation, showed the pricing. If you click on solutions, you can see some example solutions that are built in Azure. If you go to different categories, like click on digital marketing, we can go here and see some example information about digital marketing solutions in Azure. If we scroll down to the bottom, we can see some example solution architectures. I'll click on this first one, Simple Digital Marketing Website. We can see a diagram kind of showing how the different services would fit together and what services we would use. And then we can scroll down and it'll list out the services to use for that, as well as linking to the documentation. So we can get more ideas on examples on what services to use when and stuff through here in this documentation. All right, so that completes kind of the demo and running through IaaS and PaaS and stuff and what resource groups are and things. I hope this helps you in building solutions in Azure, and some of you that are new helps you with learning more about Azure. I'd like to thank you for joining me today on this webinar. Have a good day.